All right, it's exactly 1 o'clock. Welcome everyone to a presentation session 3, the seriousness of dismissed texts. We have 3 presenters today who I'll introduce before they get started. But before that, I just want to tell you about the format we've agreed upon. We're going to, each one of the presenters will make their presentation, and then we'll have some time, maybe 5 minutes, for questions and comments directed to the particular presentation. Then we're going to reserve 10 to 15 minutes at the end to think about the connections between these presentations. I encourage everyone to use during the question period to use the hand raise function, but also to turn on your mics and ask your question aloud. But as people are making presentations, feel free to post up questions in the chat. And then the last thing I'll say is, presenters, you don't need to. That can be nice, or that can be disruptive. You don't need to respond to the questions that pop up in chat while you're making your presentations. We can reserve those for the end, and I'll look back through them and repose questions if need be. So don't let them throw you off your game at all. Okay, any questions before we begin from anybody? All right, then let me introduce our presenters in this panel. Time to move. Our first presenter today is Stephanie Biase from Fairleigh Dickinson University. Her talk is entitled "Giving Girls a Voice: The Evolution of Girlhood in Children's Literature." The second presenter is Amirah Elayan, and from Paterson University, and her talk is entitled "Expanding the Horizons of Literature: An Exploration of Marathon Watching and Why It Is So Important to Include TV in Our Literary Conversation." And finally, we'll have Lorenzo Genovese from the University of Hartford, whose talk is entitled "Understanding the Comedic Farce in Cinema." And now, without further ado, I turn it over to our first speaker, Stephanie.
Hi, everyone. So let me just share my screen. Okay. And let me present. All right, so hopefully everyone can see that. Let me just move you all so I can see. Okay, so this is my research that I was planning on doing last year, before the pandemic and, the world shut down. That was when I had actually conducted the research and written my paper. But now I'm very thankful to be able to get to do this virtual conference. My presentation is called "Giving Girls a Voice: The Evolution of Girlhood in Children's Literature," and I'm Stephanie Biase. So just a quick background on my research. It's in the field of children's literature, which isn't always the most discussed topic of literature, especially in universities and in the scholarly field and things like that. However, I was really passionate about this first when I took a class at Fairleigh Dickinson. It was a literature course called Children's Literature with Dr. Patrick. And I sort of just realized, I was like, there's a field for this. I'm like, I love this. This is perfect. And I was able to tie in my passion of wanting to become a teacher. And so with the mentorship that Dr. Patrick provided me, I then went to my local library and I went to the children's literature section and I just started looking through the books. And I realized that a lot of the books that were designed for girls had pastel colors on them, were very feminine and girly, and that the books designed for boy readers were very masculine with, red and black and superheroes on it. And it made me wonder if what's on the cover of the book, as well as how the characters are portrayed, how that influences readers, young readers specifically, but then girl readers as well. And then with this, I knew I wanted to tie it into education and try to see what strategies could be used. And this actually now has an even greater purpose for me this year because I'm currently student teaching in a 3rd grade classroom. And I've been able to see, what kind of literature is in the classroom and what kind of things would I want to do as a future teacher. So looking ahead, some guiding questions that really focused my research was really, what does it mean to be a girl based on how literature is portraying young girl protagonists, as well as what's on the covers and what other characters are kind of supporting these norms and stereotypical behaviors or not. And based on how these characters are being portrayed, how does that influence our identity and societal expectations? And I sort of came up with these terms, which are out there in society, but I sort of use them to kind of build my research on with tomboys and girly girls and the sort of spectrum of girlhood that's created, which I'll discuss later in my research. So just some background, my basic structure for my research is I look at 4 categories of literature, and the basic structure is I compare a more traditional foundational text with a more modern text to compare themes and the young girl characters as well. So I look at domestic stories for girls, detective stories for girls, adventure stories for girls, and then girl activists in fiction. And then the last piece is then tying in the elementary education component specifically, which I'll get into later in my research. So for this presentation specifically, I'm just going to be focusing on 3 of the books, which are really the foundational texts of my research. And that includes That Girl, Lucy Moon, The Penderwicks, and Little Women. And so across these 3 books, I was looking at these overarching themes about how the young girl protagonists are being portrayed, and then where does that influence their placement on this spectrum of girlhood that gets created, which is often polarizing. And then with that, part of where girls would place themselves is because they're influenced by other characters around them who either enforce gender norms and behaviors or could even challenge those behaviors. And then the last piece that greatly influences young girls in the literature as well as in society is the family structure. And what I found is that in this tomboy literature is that there's an inversion of the traditional family. And we then see this motif of the absent mother and the present father, and how all this influences the girl protagonists, thus the girl readers. So I'll get all into all of that as we go on. Again, the theme of pink, lighthearted children's literature. We'll keep going. So first, just to define some terms, because we may have heard of these terms, girly girl, tomboy, and just, society casually, but to define it to this research, a girly girl is a young girl associated with the color pink, being a very traditional feminine girl who's engaging in stereotypical behaviors. They have to be elegant. They're often nurturing, their mothers or teachers or, any field like that. But they also usually yearn for some sort of romantic, happily ever after relationship. And then on the other end of the spectrum is this idea of a tomboy. So it's defined as a spirited or boisterous boy or a wild girl. And what I thought was so interesting is that this term is actually defined in terms of masculinity, of what it's like to be a boy, because these girls who identify as tomboys see themselves as doing these boy things. But what's interesting is that even though you can be a tomboy as a young character or a young girl in these literature and in society, this was something that was often negative. And it was okay to be a tomboy when you're young, but it's something that should be repressed and tamed as the girl matured and grew into adolescence and ultimately womanhood, because this was negative. This isn't how a proper woman should behave. And so with that, I then created this spectrum of girlhood based on how I saw it from the literature. And there's really these polarizing ideas. There's this one end, the girly girl side or the pink end, and then the other side, the tomboy end or the blue end. And so in the first image, this is from the foundational text of Little Women. And this is seeing the 4 sisters of where they would be placed, with one being that, ideal girl who matures into the woman, and the other one being the self-proclaimed tomboy. And then the image below that, I then take the characters from Little Women as well as my other 2 foundational texts, Lucy Moon and The Penderwicks, and place the main characters on the spectrum. And so this would be the traditional spectrum of where literature would place these girls, either being at one end or the other, or in the case of Jo, in the middle, being the self-proclaimed tomboy, but ultimately being forced to try to repress these feelings. And so it forces girls to choose a side. However, with that, I then created my own version of the continuum of how I feel that these girls should be portrayed and how this impacts young girl readers. Instead, there really should be this middle area or this, purple area, if you are looking at, kind of this the stereotypical colors, or this gray area really, where most girls in the books that I was researching, as well as in society, would really place themselves somewhere in the middle. Maybe they lean a little bit more towards one end like Meg, or the other end depending, but they would usually be a combination of both characteristics. And I felt that if we could make this a little bit more normalized and be able to actually express it and see it in literature, it would help girls with their own identity and their own self-expression to not have to choose one side or the other, but to be a combination of both and feel comfortable identifying and expressing that, even though it's not presented as much in the literature currently. So another piece of this of where girls actually place themselves on this continuum has to do with the other characters around them. They either act as enforcers of gendered norms and behaviors, or they challenge those expectations and those stereotypical behaviors. So one of the common things that was seen was there's the typical sort of male character who's the enforcer. He has these patriarchal controls over the young girls, and it's consistent throughout the literature. An example was in the story Lucy Moon, Principal Adams, who's the principal of the middle school that she's at, is controlling her and is trying to get her to repress her activist spirit. And he's a very authoritative, masculine character who's trying to control and suppress. However, on the other end of that, we actually see male characters who challenge the stereotypical behaviors. And this is actually seen with Lucy's father, who is a caring father figure. The mother actually leaves to go pursue her own career opportunities, and the father is left to sort of parent on his own Lucy as a young teenage girl and try to be there for her and support her. And even though he struggles at the beginning, he does ultimately support her emotionally and doesn't try to suppress her, but rather encourage her in her beliefs. And the other piece of this is there's these older women often in the literature who are trying to impart the stereotypical norms, behaviors onto the young girls, almost as a role model, but it often becomes, the pressure and is almost suffocating for a lot of the young girls as they're developing, and they feel like this is supposed to be their guide. So it's usually from the traditional mother. So in Little Women, the mother Marmee, she's trying to impart these norms onto her girls to become proper women. However, in the other two books, Lucy Moon and the Penderwicks, it's the older women of the story. They often are either divorced or they lost their husbands, and they're sort of this staple in the community, including Miss Wiggins and Miss Tifton, and they sort of see that they have to help these young girls develop based on their own challenges and experiences that they had. And so then the other piece of this that influences young girl development is the absent mother and the present father. So again, family is influential on the young girl's development. And based on the tomboy literature, this theme that I found is that the traditional family structure was actually being inverted. So the traditional family in most cases with the children's literature is that the mother is usually the one who's nurturing and caring for the children. And we see that with Marmee. They're trying to make sure her 4 daughters grow up to be proper women. However, in this tomboy literature, there's been a shift where often the mother is removed either due to a career opportunity, like in Lucy Moon, or she actually has died, like in the Penderwicks. And often this is partly influenced by Disney. The Disney canon has been very influential in literature and in society. And oftentimes this motif is used to help give girls' stories a place to start. And so in this sort of tomboy literature, I found that really in order to identify as a tomboy, as a young girl, you have to remove the mother altogether. And I kind of thought, well, why can't you have both? Why can't you say, well, I'm a tomboy, but still have, a traditional family or any sort of family structure that you need to support you in your development? Like having a mother doesn't always have to pressure or squash that identity. And as I said, this was seen in really the 2 more modern texts, was inverting this structure, but was found throughout the research as well. And so with this, because the mother is being removed for some reason and we're left with the father who's trying to parent, who's often not as effective, unfortunately, as the mother in the literature. Usually it's because he's trying to maintain his own ego or his own masculinity, you know, as that kind of stereotypical male. Oftentimes in literature, they're just not as effective as a mother, because mothers are seen as innate nurturers and caregivers. So because of this, a replacement mother is needed to help these young girls on their journey, to help them develop into young women, specifically into proper young women. But ultimately, the idea is that even though the mother may be gone, you still need that mothering figure. And this is seen in the Penderwick. So the mother has died, and it's left up to Rosalind, who's the oldest sister, to really step in and help care for her younger sisters. The only issue with this is that Rosalind herself is still a young girl. She's still developing. She's not ready to be a mother. She's only a teenager. And so because of that, she kind of gets replaced by the sort of epitome of nurturing, domesticity, really everything that you would want in a surrogate mother, with the maid Churchy, because she cooks for them, she cleans, she sews their dresses. It's everything to really help these girls develop onto this proper path. And then in Lucy Moon, we see this because, as I mentioned, the mother actually goes to pursue her own career goals and leaves the father almost as a single parent to help raise Lucy, who is also a teenager and trying to deal with the struggles of middle school and all of that. But even though he struggles, especially at the beginning, he does kind of find his footing and is able to be there for her more emotionally. But he's still often not the best kind of replacement mother. So instead, Lucy finds really more emotional comfort with her best friend's mother, Mrs. Rosendahl. And Mrs. Rosendahl is supposed to show that, you know, mothers can do it all. She owns her own bakery business, which shows that she's baking and she's in the kitchen. However, she's able to still be there for her daughter as well as Lucy and someone else's daughter. So she's sort of that epitome as well of, you know, you could be a working mother, but you should still be, you know, at home or able to care for your children. So Lucy's mother often gets shamed really for leaving the home to pursue her own career path. And so with that, I then applied this into education, specifically elementary education, because that's the path now that I'm choosing. And like I said, this research has really taken on more of a inspiration to me this year because I'm actually student teaching. Whereas when I was first writing it, I was sort of just excited to become a future teacher. And now I can actually see where I can apply it into my future classroom, or to even see the third graders that I'm working with, see what kind of literature that they're working with. And so one thing I want to make sure that I have in my future classroom and I provide for my students is this diverse literature. So to have books, to have authentic, meaningful literature that acts as both windows and mirrors for students. They can see themselves represented in the literature, and they can also learn about other diverse perspectives or genders or other cultures, whatever it may be, just to be able to have a conversation, but also to increase awareness, increase acceptance, as well. And this starts in the younger grades. You know, oftentimes we expect these students to be able to have these kind of conversations, you know, in high school, but the students don't have the foundation for that. And so we could give that at the elementary level, then we can really support students in that process. And so part of this is by having diverse literature, it gives students more choice and voice to be able to express, you know, their feelings or express their identities based on what they're seeing or, you know, different perspectives that's going on in the literature. And one piece of this as a teaching strategy that I plan on implementing is having this balanced literacy classroom. And really all the method is having authentic, diverse, meaningful, real literature in the classroom and using that to teach not only reading skills, but to have meaningful conversations about books. So to be able to take the time and say, you know, how did you feel about this book? And that sort of ties in this reader response opportunity that we don't give students that often, especially in high school, but very little, even if so, in elementary school. Just having a time and a place to reflect on your reading, any connections, emotional, you know, discussions that you may want to have about the literature. And this ties into my last piece of having more of a communal reading opportunity for students. And I was actually able to research this idea further in my master's thesis, since I'm a graduate student in the field of education, because there's some opportunity for communal reading at the high school level, depending, not as much, but again, very little at the elementary level. But it's important to give students a safe place and a chance to be able to discuss literature, and it could be in a book club setting. So not reading just to answer questions or reading to do well on the test, but reading for enjoyment, reading in a comfortable environment, and reading to discuss, this is a connection I had, or maybe this part really bothered me, or even questions like, if the character's gender changed, how would you feel about that? So to get at those more meaningful and more thoughtful questions that there's not often that much time for in the classroom that there should be, and giving that foundation for elementary students to help build on that for their future careers in school, but as well as beyond school, to help create these and foster these creative, original thinkers. And so with that, these are all the books that I looked at in my research. So maybe you know of some, or maybe not. Again, a lot of them were new to me that I sort of just found when I was looking through the library in the children's literature section. And this research has really been personal for me in my personal journey, but it's just something that I loved working on and I enjoyed it. It was something I was very passionate about. And so I'm happy that it has continued beyond, really into a multi-year sort of research and into a master's thesis as well. And it just makes me excited about literature to add to the field, as well as in the field of education. So if there are any questions or comments, I'd love to discuss with you. So thank you very much. And I will.
Awesome job, Steph.
Thank you.
We have about 4 minutes for questions. So some questions or comments?
I want to know what you think is the most progressive book in your list, and also if you think any progression has been made in recent years, because I also I tutor young girls. And so we do a lot of literature with young women too. And so I'm interested to know what you think the progression has been perhaps in recent years.
Yes, great question. I think in my research, the most progressive book that there was the one that I discussed was Lucy Moon, because that one actually dealt really head on from a middle school girl's perspective, dealing with issues of gender inequality, as well as what's going on within a middle school setting, as well as within the society. That one actually addressed most of the issues of society the best, and gave more of a voice to being an activist and expressing yourself, as a girl, as a female, more than really all the other ones. And I think overall, and I say that, I think literature has done a much better job of evolving, with the times. I mean, just even comparing Little Women, which was really from the 1800s, to Lucy Moon, which I believe was published in 2013, just seeing that originally it was, you could be a tomboy as a young girl, but you had to change your feelings. With Lucy Moon, it was, she's a tomboy through and through. She wavers slightly because of the societal pressures, but ultimately she holds on to those feelings and holds on to, her kind of determination and self-expression and identity as a girl, and what that means to her, with gender rights and equality and all different things. And I feel like that's more of the message that literature has been leaning towards and has been doing a very positive job. I think there's always room for improvement, but I think overall, I think there's been a better push for that.
There's a really terrific question for you from Jessica in the chat if you want to have a quick look.
Sure.
Or I can read it if you prefer.
Oh, yes. Yeah, so choosing the books, it was really just my mentor kind of said, go to the library, go to the children's literature section and just do an initial walkthrough. Just kind of look through, because I had some in my mind of, I knew I want to talk, about this topic, so let me go to this go-to book that I had. But really, most of my books came from actually just looking through the library, even though it kind of sounds crazy. I did some research, but I went through and I was able to pick them out. I said, oh, like this one's a book for girls, this one's a book for boys. And my stack just got large. And I said, how come it's so easy to say this is for girls, or just, is intended really for a girl audience, whereas this is for a boy audience? And that was what sort of got like the wheels spinning. And I was like, wait a second. I'm like, this is causing some alarm. And I really just went through the library. Now I guess you have to use a virtual library, but it was a library at the time. And the main differences between the traditional texts was really, I was kind of saying this before, but really just the way that the girls are portrayed. I mean, just comparing Little Women to Lucy Moon, the main character, who's the self-proclaimed tomboy, is Jo. And she really, says, like, I wish I was a boy in the book. She chops her hair off. That's something that she's really passionate about. But and she maintains some of that, but due to societal, constraints and pressure, she does lose some of that, and she's forced into taking that more traditional path and become a proper woman, like her older sister and the women around her. Whereas compared to Lucy Moon, she, like I said, really holds on to those beliefs, and she doesn't waver as much. She has some kind of dealings with society pressure, but she really sticks to, what she feels it means to be a girl, and holds on to that.
Thank you for those questions, everyone. I'm going to move us to our next presenter. Jessica posted another excellent question in the chat, but we'll save that. I think that will be something we can come back to at the end. So, Amirah, I turn it over to you.
Thank you. My name's Amirah Elayan. I'm a lit major, and I am currently studying a concentration of creative writing. Sorry, I'm just trying to pull up my presentation. As well as I have a associate's in literature, and I'm focusing on a minor in world literature as well. My topic of interest today is why television should be considered literature and how marathon watching ties into that. And so you'll see that unfold as we go along. Let me just pull up a timer for myself. So to start this conversation, we're going to talk about what literature is. We're going to look at the Britannica entry Literature by Kenneth Rexroth, and what he has to say. He sort of says that literature is just a body of written works, and that is the most umbrella term and definition that you can have for something. And that's okay, because a lot of work kind of automatically falls into the definition of literature. Most typically, it's poetry, plays, novels, as well as certain other pieces like Letters from an American Farmer, which is a letter by Creedcourt. Now, letters are not automatically literature, but Creedcourt does this amazing job establishing a sort of story of what America is at the time of writing, which was the early 1800s, late 1700s-ish. And what he does is he sort of falls into these characteristics of literature. So if you're like, why does Creedcourt's letters get to be literature, but then the letter I wrote to my girlfriend last week doesn't? Well, here's what literature kind of establishes. It kind of has to be like a work of art. When you read literature, you want to have something that's engaging in terms of aesthetic value, artistic merit, and you want it to be thematic. You want it to hold themes that are relatable to people who are not just yourself or not just in your country, but kind of on a worldly basis. We say this a lot with Shakespeare. He is universal. And this applies to many people as well who have written amazing works in the East and the West. And we also want works that are, aware of their environment. So when we read books like The River Kai, which is Japanese literature, women's literature, we're not just reading about the progression of women's rights in Japan. We're looking at how women all over the world are struggling to get rights and how they're struggling in their environment. And so we have this awareness of the socio-political and economic environments and how they, affect the work, how it's portrayed in the work. And that's what makes the work important. And it also, has to be meaningful to the readers. You can't have a work that's not meaningful, and it to be considered literature or artistic. Now, if you're wondering, how do we develop what is aesthetic, what is artistic, what's a universal theme? Well, this actually changes and changes frequently. And we divide literature into eras for a reason. So eras of literature sort of determine what is exactly, the artistic merit, the aesthetic value, and why we sort of look at certain works as literature, even though they don't compare to others. So for example, in the Romantic era, which is typically from 1776 to about the middle of the 1800s, we have works like Frankenstein, or really long poetic essays about nature. We have Mary Shelley and Jane Austen, who fall into this period of Romanticism. And their work is defined by long lines. They're defined by poetic language, unending sentences, 1,000,002 commas. And then you look at Don DeLillo's White Noise, and he has these brief sentences. They're very mechanical. His language is extremely simple. You can totally get what's going on. And it's also very sciencey in a way that Frankenstein is not. Frankenstein is a religious science and a fear of what science will do to religion. Don DeLillo is a scientist who's looking at the world and look at what the government is doing to us, dude. And you're like, whoa, these are so different. How are they both literature? Well, it's because the eras constitute of different things. We're going to focus on postmodernism and contemporary literature. For the sake of this argument, I know that when you Google contemporary literature, I'm sorry for the background noise. I know when we look at contemporary literature, it's often defined as an umbrella term from anything post the Second World War up until the present. But I believe that we've established a sort of contemporary genre as of recent. And so what we're going to do is we're going to take postmodernism from 1945 until the late 90s or 1999. And we're going to look at contemporary literature as sort of picking up from where postmodernism left off and launching us into the present. And we are sort of in this era of contemporary lit right now. What are the differences? So postmodernism has a strong pop culture relationship. It is extremely anti-government. It's very, or anti-authoritarian as well. It's very skeptical of the world. Your narrators are often unreliable. There's this very breaking of the fourth wall, and you see this in postmodernism movies as well as written literature. We see a collapse of highbrow culture. If you're not sure what highbrow culture is, it's sort of the idea that literature is meant to be holier than thou and above you. And so a lot of the time you have highbrow artists who use different languages, who use really difficult words, who, kind of go back to the romantic, unending sentences fluff. And this is also very modernist. So we see in postmodernism, people are sick of it. They don't want highbrow anymore. They want things to be accessible. People want to read and people want to learn, and they don't want this fluff in between. They don't want to learn 10 languages to know what your work means. They just want work that is meaningful. And so the highbrow sort of society collapses in this. And this is best represented actually in the 1990s version of Romeo and Juliet, because it is what is typically considered a highbrow piece depicted in a trashy teen romance film about gangs and, gauziness and all this bright stuff. To sort of move on, we have contemporary literature on the other hand, which if you've noticed and you've picked up a lot of contemporary literature, is very gritty. It doesn't focus on the imperfections of government. It focuses on the imperfection of self. And the biggest thing about contemporary literature is that we are not perfect people and that we are, very flawed. And so main characters tend to be extremely flawed, and they tend to, have language that's not very, the way that Don DeLillo might write very concise sentences that are meant to move the story along. You might see more humanistic interactions. a very distinct usage of conversational language to move on the point. And it sort of is an attempt to be as realistic as possible. We also see a great jump in dystopia and a rise in diverse literature, which is extremely great because we are now getting a wide range of voices who are looking at the world and making a commentary on it. So we're going to kind of shift this conversation, and I've already touched on it a little, as how contemporary fiction correlates to TV. Looking at popular contemporary literature, what do we have? Some of the most popular books in the past 10 years is The Queen's Gambit, The Handmaid's Tale, Little Fires Everywhere, Big Little Lies, You. Well, what the heck do they all have in common? Big Little Lies is an HBO limited series as well. The Handmaid's Tale is a Hulu series. Little Fires Everywhere, another Hulu series. The Queen's Gambit is a limited series on Netflix. And then we have You, another limited series. And so if you're asking me, well, what is the difference in translation here? Why do we take books and make them TV? Part of it is accessibility. There's a lot of people who don't have the time to read necessarily or dedicate themselves to reading. And there are some people who, may be unable to read because of disabilities. And so the translation of putting it on TV makes it accessible for people who are perhaps too tired or perhaps like to enjoy the noise that comes with it or are unable to read. And another difference is that obviously when we read a book, we have to kind of make it up by ourselves. But when we're watching it, they sort of like a play provide you with an experience. And so plays are often said to be better seen than read. And the same goes for TV. TV has sort of screenwriting genres within it. There are certain styles that come with it, the same with writing. And you'll see that although they seem quite different, they're actually very much the same. And so now we have to understand, how do we read TV? Well, we read it by marathon watching. I don't know about you, but when I read a book, I like to just focus on one book at a time so I consistently have all my points together. And I have all the characters together. People do this with watching TV as well. And according to Lisa G. Perks, who is a graduate student who did this wonderful big study on how we read television, we see that she says, it is a holistic form of engagement. And it is, because people engage with marathon watching the way they would engage with books. It is a way for us to look at TV and we, read it by watching it a lot or multiple episodes in one sitting, the way that we might read multiple chapters in one sitting. And we engage with it through community, through creating our own literature, through talking to other people about it on Twitter, on Instagram, on Tumblr. And we see it all over. There's millions of accounts on Tumblr that are dedicated, and Twitter that are dedicated to talking about TV shows and books and talking about the characters in TV, the character development, the themes that they find. People are writing essays on Tumblr about it. People write video essays on YouTube and they read them out, essentially doing what I'm doing right now for you guys on YouTube to millions of people and giving them the experience of an academic setting in a much more accessible format. And that's a really big part of this, is that TV makes literature and the academic conversation accessible to people. And it engages people who may have been rejected from academia. So one of our examples here is The Adorable Misogyny of the Big Bang Theory by the Pop Culture Detective. You may have seen this. It has 5.7 million views. And he looks at the Big Bang Theory, which is often scrubbed off as a nuisance comedy about some nerd guys who don't really know much at all, And so he gives this very in-depth, over 30-minute essay about how misogyny is used to make these characters sort of look better or more sympathetic. And he really goes into depth about it, exploiting these themes and also looking at how these men are infantilized for the sake of the show. A very in-depth conversation to have about something that's often brushed off. In another video by Sarah Zed, Double Standards and Diverse Media, she really goes into how, and she sort of groups these two topics together of TV and literature about diverse people and how many white audiences may treat it and how it's received and if it's ever deemed good enough or what progress needs to be made. Another very, very in-depth conversation that may be brushed off because it's, just young adult literature. It's just a cartoon. But these people don't see it as that. This is a way to engage with the literature in front of us, the things that we watch, and to make it very meaningful and universal, which they are. And, it's a really big part of this is that it really does make it accessible to many people and also expands the idea of literature and the literary format. So to conclude, I think that, the biggest takeaway from this is not only is it accessible academia, but it's expanding the scholarly community to include things that it may have never included before and to look at things it may not have considered previously. And this is very important because there is a big push to make the scholarly community more accessible to people. And this is just part of it. This is part of that conversation. So if I were to leave you with anything and to pull a Miss Congeniality, if you were to put me on a stage and ask me how I would change the world, I would say make TV literature. And if you didn't like that answer, I would say world peace. And that's my presentation.
Thank you. And we have 5 minutes for questions and comments. Jessica posted a question about creating canon formation that you might want to look at. I think you were kind of addressing that in your conclusion, but you might want to revisit.
Do you think creating a canon or on those? If you mean, I know there are sort of different definitions of canon, perhaps. If you mean in terms of how some people might say this is canon and this is a fan's perspective, I think that canon is whatever is given to you. This is a typical definition amongst fans and in communities I've engaged with. The canon is just what's given to you. When you're creating your own literature, whether that is fan fiction, whether it's your interpretation in an essay, whether that's creating a world that's been inspired by it, by the way that many writers do, that's your sort of drift from canon. That's your moving away from it, I believe. If that doesn't answer your question or if I've misinterpreted it, please let me know and I'll clarify a little bit. But I think canon is sort of just what you're given and how you work with it outside of that. It's up to you.
Amirah, I'm going to ask you to stop screen sharing so we can see everybody's face in one plane. A million things to remember when you're presenting.
Yeah. Oh, here we go. Stop share.
There you go. One interesting thing that struck me while you were talking, I love that you started with the definition of literature. Very often something like a literary period is defined not by the people who are working in it, but by the next generation. So it'll be interesting to see if contemporary literature becomes something else, right? At some point when artists begin to say, we're doing something different. They were doing this, let's call it this thing, right? And now we've moved on.
Yeah, I think that's kind of why I put them in separate categories, because I believe that while they're similar, postmodernism is very different from many of the books that we're seeing. We have books like Eleanor Oliphant, which is very fast and conversational, like a Gilmore Girls episode. And we're seeing a lot more of this conversational track being taken on and almost TV script-like track being taken on in writing. And I notice as a writer, I do it myself, where we kind of imitate what we watch.
Gabrielle?
Hi, I also had a question about canon similar to Jessica, and I'm using the definition of the literary canon, meaning the list of what is acceptable or what we consider as literature, kind of like how the traditional Western books that we see on like school reading lists would be considered the canon.
Sure.
My question being, in talking about incorporating not just books from the West, but also books from the East, but also television shows and all these things, do you see the need for there to even be a canon in that sense? Or should we just get rid of our list in general?
I do think that there is always going to be a canon. just because there is sort of this air of what we deem should be studied and what we may deem to be mediocre and, you know, all sorts of things. And I think a canon sort of also defines a little bit. In an ideal world, there would be no canon and everything would be accepted as literature. But I don't foresee that, you know, essentially happening. I think if there was a canon, some very popular ones may be, you know, kind of joke shows like The Office, which have been looked at very seriously in many works across the internet. And kind of more serious ones like The Handmaid's Tale, which although it has a book counterpart, the show differs from it and makes its own points and its own stances. I think it really depends on where this conversation takes us. And I think TV, it's hard to define the canon because maybe a show is really great up until a certain point, and then what do you do with the rest of it? You know what I mean? So I hope that answers.
Thank you.
We have time for one more question or comment. Yes, Jessica.
I was wondering, how do you foresee a shift in like genre going in integrating TV or movies into what is considered literature? Because they're so much larger than books, not including like book collections, that it makes it more easy to cross between different genres. I don't know if you've thought into like how things would be classified or organized or considered.
I've thought about it a little, and you know, I think about this a lot because I do enjoy engaging with it as a literary art. And I think it would be very interesting to see TV sort of get these larger scopes of genre. I know we sort of already have TV genres, but you know, it would be really interesting to see genre redefined and perhaps to be, you know, placed within the genres of books. We have, you know, books that almost have no genre, like they're often called chick flick books, and they kind of correlate with chick flick movies. And it's like, if we could create a better scope of genres that were to fit literature and TV, I think that would be so awesome, you know. I don't know exactly what we would call them, but it would be cool, like super genres almost.
Well, you guys can start working on that. Okay, I think that we're at a point where we should move to our third presenter. Lorenzo, we're going to turn things over to you.
Let me just share my screen. All right. Hello, everyone. So my name is Lorenzo Genovese, and I attend the University of Hartford. I'm a double major in film and English with concentrations respectively in screenwriting and literature. So I'm thrilled to have been selected by the council to present my research and to congratulate the presenters in this panel who preceded me, Stephanie and Amirah, and thank the members of the council, my two advisors at the University of Hartford, Lauren Cook and Amanda Walling, and Dr. Jones and Dr. Oakes, who have guided me through the whole NRHC process. So this topic, as we have established for these presentations, is the seriousness of dismissed texts. I couldn't have thought of a better name for the medium of screenwriting itself, because it certainly isn't the first type of writing that comes to mind when thinking of the discipline as a whole. There's a type of stigma when it comes to film and television, because people tend to associate it with entertainment and not academics, which is a huge limitation for the potential that it has. I believe that the art of screenwriting in cinema has just as much educational value as it does amusement value. And both are extremely important components of the everyday lives of individuals, especially over the past year with the COVID-19 pandemic that we encountered. which is something that I'll continue to address as this presentation moves forward. Part of the reason why I wanted to study an aspect of screenwriting was to show the different abilities it has, not only for screenwriters and those entertained by film and television, but also for what it could teach people generally, and how it can provide them with an escape, if you will, from the unprecedented times that we've recently endured. I wanted to model my thesis project on what I want my career post-college to involve, and that is comedic screenwriting. Comedy is such a unique topic because it plays around with our expectations and the norms of reality. We are students of our own humanity, and by that I mean that we are always taking everything we do and think into deep consideration, whether consciously or not. It might be a single thought or an elaborate plan, but regardless of which, we have expectations of outcomes and reactions ready for whatever the next step entails. However, life doesn't always play out the way we expect it to, which is where disruptions and deviations come in. Whether we realize it or not, these are experiences that help us separate desirable and normal facets of life from undesirable and uncommon facets of life. With that being said, comedy films, which play off of ridiculous, disruptive moments, serve as a parallel to human life. Disruptions to life are almost always met with some kind of emotional reaction. One of the more common emotions felt by things that go awry is humor. Even if the situation isn't per se funny, there can be humor found in the fact that something happened that was not intended to. And most of the time, it's not even consciously humorous. A professor of philosophy at the University of Maryland named Peter Carruthers was quoted as saying, "It turns out that thoughts such as decisions and judgments should not be considered to be conscious. They are not always accessible in working memory, nor are we directly aware of them." And I would argue that the observation of humanity is the basis for comedic screenwriting, because screenwriters craft pieces centered around an obstruction from reality, keeping in mind what viewers expect to happen, and through their movement away from that, screenplays are met with comical reception. This is just one of the many points of connection between film and real life that exist, and teaches us that we can perhaps compare real situations with those that are fictionally developed. So just a little crash course in screenwriting for anyone who might be unfamiliar with it. Screenwriting is the official title for storytelling in the mediums of film and television. And every television show or film follows a screenplay that gives direction to production members, directors, actors, actresses, and basically everybody involved with it. There's a notable pioneer of screenwriting named Sid Field, whose contributions to screenwriting are widespread, and I extensively studied his teachings during the process of doing my thesis. He's quoted as saying that the screenplay is the most pertinent part of any sort of production, which is why I opted to include an original feature-length screenplay as the hybrid component of my project. And when I say feature-length, I'm talking about your typical hour and a half to 2 hours worth of material. During the screenwriting process, writers have to adhere to strict formatting in terms of layout. They have to include everything they want people to hear and screen the scene, which includes descriptions of settings, characters, costumes, and any noises, sounds, or audio that needs to be involved in any way. Another consideration is cinematography, which is defined as the art of how things are arranged on screen. So how we are seeing things and what expectations that directors will have when we see them. So this involves camera work, shooting styles, audio, lighting, special visual effects, and I'm going into everything that happens behind the scenes, not only to give you all a clearer idea of what happens, but also to reflect on this panel's theme, because it's serious work that requires a lot of discipline that tends to get dismissed because of the fact that it's labeled as entertainment. taking that a step further, screenwriters also need to consider what all other fiction writers, playwrights, and poets need to consider. And that would be conventions associated with different styles and genres. The genre of comedy is multi-layered and actually spawns into many different subgenres like romantic comedy, dark comedy, and farce, the latter of which is the subgenre that I've chosen to work with on this project. Farce is a type of comedy that has not only been widely used in screenwriting, but it also has uses that go back to the Middle Ages with theatrical drama. According to the early career of farce in theatrical vocabulary, which was a source that I studied for my research, the history of farce in the theater begins in France during the Middle Ages, and according to a well-established theory, it may be traced back to the liturgical origins of the drama itself. So it's a style of writing that has been in existence for centuries and has influenced the growth of general comedy greatly. Farce is different today than it was when it started, but the core features of the subgenre still exist. And its purpose is to convey comedy through heightened deviations of variant societal, that's what I meant to say, and situational norms, or in other words, to make the cycle of events within a film seem so absurd or unrealistic that it has some sort of humorous effect. Screenwriters can successfully achieve a farcical script by inciting highly exaggerated or improbable circumstances going against well-established social codes, incorporating elements of surprise, and creating character types whose actions and dialogue further the absurdity of the story. Despite the fact that farce has been around for a while and that its influence can be traced, there is still a lot to be discovered about farce and the abilities that it has, especially in the modern day, which is why I wanted to take on the task of researching farce in order to come up with nuanced conclusions about the subgenre. I think the COVID-19 pandemic has really given me a unique perspective to work with because it has helped me realize the role that farce has as an escape for people. So many people have looked and continue to look to film, specifically comedy, as either a source of comfort from the harshness of reality or to even make sense of everything. Because in a way, it feels like for the past year, we've been living in a farcical comedy just based off of how abnormal everything has felt like. And so I really focused in my thesis research about the ways in which farce coincides with real life. For my thesis research, in addition to reading multiple peer-reviewed articles, studying farce in general screenwriting, and reading Sid Field's textbook about screenwriting, I reviewed 3 farcical comedy films to better acquaint myself with the genre and see examples of the types of classifications and farce up close and personal. I tried to pick 3 films that were different in style and had different directors and tones attached to them. They each have different, I would say, subgenres within the subgenre of farce. High Anxiety, Death of Funeral, and The Death of Stalin, respectively directed by Mel Brooks, Frank Oz, and Armando Iannucci. I would say that High Anxiety is probably a fantasy farce. Death at a Funeral would be more of a melodramatic farce, and the Death of Stalin would be a dark humored farce. And the purpose of watching these films was to recognize certain aspects of farce within them. High Anxiety is about a psychologist played by Mel Brooks, who also directed it, who has a high anxiety disorder and is ironically hired to work at an institute for people who also have high anxiety. An example of farce within high anxiety would be high exaggeration. The way that the characters speak, act, and interact with one another is completely outrageous because they aren't ways we'd expect people to act generally, especially in a professional institution. In Death at a Funeral, which is about the craziness of a dysfunctional family who is mourning the loss of the head of the family. promotes the farcical aspects of the element of surprise and quickness of pace. Using surprising features within screenwriting sets obstacles within the realm of the film, which in turn makes exaggeration a lot more feasible. Quickness of pace is basically when one event happens right after the next at a very fast pace, and that gives audience members the illusion they are in a state of chaos, which again is apt for farce. And In the Death of Stalin, which is, like I said, a dark humored farce about the last days of Joseph Stalin's life and the pursuit of power that emerged between those who worked for him, uses farce in perhaps the most profane way. They mock social codes, which not only works well in making viewers feel appalled, but also decimates their expectations completely. As an example, the characters mock the severity of the political system of the time, which catches unsuspecting filmgoers by total surprise. It is within those aspects of film that I found inspiration to create my own farcical screenplay. And before I dive into that, I researched farce from a literary standpoint, and through that reading, I was able to garner a better comprehension of how farce should be approached. Authors Mel Halitzer and Mark Schatz wrote a book called Comedy Writing Secrets, in which they talk about how farce should be looked at through a scientific lens, saying, "We laugh most often to cover our feelings of embarrassment. This can be a result of either having unintentionally done or said something foolish or tricked. And if we have been tricked, oh, my bad. If we have been tricked, we have been surprised." And considering laughter from a scientific standpoint is extremely beneficial because it sort of creates a formula for effective farce, which is why I emphasize the study of humanity quite a bit in the early points of my research. My literary studies segued into my research question of what the purposes of farce were, and I believe that there are many potential answers to that query. Jeffrey Allen Triggs, author of a scholarly article called Roughing It, The Role of Farce in the Little Rascals Comedies, says that one theory is that farce, through its mechanical plots and stock situations, illustrates the Bergsonian notion of comedy as something mechanical and crusted upon the living. The other is that farce is governed by unreason and is therefore characterized in varying degrees by aggression, anarchic subversion, wish-filling spontaneity, and festivity. I came to the conclusion, like I said, that there are many purposes of farce, the biggest of which perhaps is that it reflects desire, whether subconscious or not, or what we know isn't possible or what we know isn't acceptable. For example, a lot of the films express ways of speaking that we know wouldn't fly, but sometimes we wish we could utilize. And this goes hand in hand with the desire of people to escape during the COVID-19 pandemic. And now, onto my screenplay, which was the bulk of my thesis project. It was a hybrid, but mainly creative work. So as I alluded to earlier, I wrote a 98-page screenplay called Blood Isn't Always Thicker Than Water, in which I got the opportunity to practice using everything I had learned about farce in action. The protagonist is Silvana, a Sicilian-American woman in her mid-80s who is unbelievably sassy, stubborn, and lacks a filter. And there are three other main characters as well. Her daughter Vivian, who is miserable and has a rough relationship with her mother, and her two grandchildren, Vance and Bella, who are rebellious teenage types. The four of them have a very tumultuous relationship, which I highlighted as an aspect of farce in my film because it heightens the conflict and makes the moments of exaggeration and improbability seem more feasible. The story starts with Bella and Vance getting into some trouble. Their father, who is Silvana's son, punishes them by sending them to stay with his mother and sister for the weekend. And it is during this time that Silvana gets a letter from her home village in Sicily, reminding her of a curse that was cast upon her many years prior that she must break if she wants to avoid terrible consequences. Knowing that Vivian won't drop everything and take her to Sicily, especially with Vance and Bella staying at their house, she fears that she won't be able to break the curse in time. She decides to therefore fake an incurable ailment, using the guise that she will soon pass away as a reason to want to visit her home village one last time. And she succeeds in that. They go to Sicily, where they stay with Silvana's last surviving sibling, Philomena, who is equally as crazy and stubborn. With the difficulty of keeping her secret, faking an illness, dealing with her family members, and the obstacles that they provide altogether, as well as trying to perform crazy tasks to break the curse, a huge challenge is presented to our protagonist. As you can tell, those are a lot of unconventional situations that lead into the next in such ways that make reality very difficult to associate with it, and that was done purposely. I wish we had the time to go over all of the different aspects of Farce that I used, because there are some improbable and exaggerated moments that I think would shock everyone, yet at the same time be sort of relatable. I will say that I used a lot of flashbacks and dream sequences, which are appropriate for Farce because they help carry the illusion of a fantasy or unrealistic moments forward in a believable manner. In those flashbacks and dream sequences, Silvana confronts the woman who cast the curse upon her, Graziella, and in those moments are tension-filled pieces of dialogue, breaking of etiquette and social codes, and other unbelievable tidbits that make it seem like a cartoon as opposed to a real film, which is the great thing about the uniqueness that Farce offers. With that being said, I could talk about my screenplay all day, but I want to make sure that I stay within the allotted time. So I want to end my presentation here and transition into the Q&A. But thank you for allowing me to speak today and for listening to my research.
Thank you. You already have two really terrific questions in the chat while you're, do you want me to read them for you, or do you want to just read through them?
I can read through them quickly. That's a good question, Dr. Jones. I do think that there are going to be post-pandemic comedies. I don't know if they're going to directly reflect the pandemic itself. I think that we might see different styles of comedy that maybe tie into certain feelings that we have had during this pandemic, that kind of go out into even further realms of absurdity, just because that's kind of what we have experienced over this past year. So I do think that is going to start a new trend for farcical comedies in this post-COVID era. And I think there was another part of the question. I think there are going to be, I think it just depends on the director, the screenwriter. I think that there are going to be those who do want to leave it behind, as you're suggesting in the other part of your question. But I do think that there is going to be some shift in the comedic farce, whether it directly kind of tied to COVID or just the ways in which we've learned to adapt and think differently, just generally. And then what cultural and social influences inspired your screenplay? So I would say from a cultural standpoint, I kind of want to do, I incorporate a lot of Sicilian. I don't want to say, I don't know if archetypes is the right word, but since I am Sicilian, part Sicilian, I kind of wanted to reflect on certain things that people would, or certain ways in which people would act, like not act in Sicily, but I used a lot of location within Sicily as inspiration. There's a lot of location barrier that kind of makes it difficult in certain areas for the characters. Language barrier is another a huge part of it that adds for comedic moments. And in terms of societal influences, I really focused on the dysfunctional family. I think that it is something that we see often in different films and television shows, but it's always executed so differently. So I really wanted to focus on how farce could impact the dysfunctional family type. Oh, there's another in the chat.
Why don't you take up Amirah's question and then we'll open it up to all three panelists with Don Jones's second question. So Amirah asked, do you feel that the literary landscape is extremely important to Farce? What role does that play?
Oh, absolutely. Especially because we do see farce in literature. It is a huge, it's been a huge part of, like I said in the presentation, theatrical drama. That's where it originated. And then it did carry over into literature. And I think that you could easily kind of take a book and put a farcical twist on it. I don't think that it necessarily matters which medium you look at it through. I think that if you are able to create that kind of absurd environment within literature, it could accomplish just as much as it would with screenwriting. And yeah.
So Don Jones's question is for presenters 2 and 3, but I think all three of you might be interested in this. Does comedy that usually contains some sadness, some tragedy, contribute to the breaking down of genres and the canon overall? And I would add to that canon in literature is so much about creating categories or organizing things and being able to say this belongs in this box, that Don Jones's question that has to do with the way that those boxes are kind of torn open a little bit, maybe opens up literature as well. Do you all three want to talk about that?
Yeah. Maybe I'll start. I think that it definitely does break down the barriers of canon, and sort of like we were talking about earlier, I think that it would be very interesting to see how genres are sort of broken down. Even in writing, we see a lot of that, of dealing with very serious issues, but putting comedic spins on it, and not just in a Shakespearean, there's a sort of jest character that's thrown in to make dark situations a little more lighthearted. We're seeing a very deep mix of genres lately across the board. And so I think, literary canon may be challenged by this.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that one could argue that genres could be kind of blending in, dissipating almost. I also, on the other hand, think that genres are opening up more and including more of what usually would not be associated with them.
I can add to that. I mean, my topic, was children's literature, but I saw even in my research, comparing the older texts to the newer texts, that even just changing, like, for example, like the family structure and kind of breaking that motif or that mold, like looking from Little Women, where it's like that traditional mother, to looking at Lucy Moon, that more modern text where the mother actually leaves, and seeing how that impact from the family structure would impact the young girl or any child or reader, really, and that really sort of shook up the idea of what makes children's literature appropriate for age, but also societal. And there's also that piece of there's sometimes that comical character, tying in that idea of farce that my other presenters were discussing. In one of the books I read, it was Nancy Drew, and at sort of the dark moments, the sort of suspenseful moments or times of conflict and stress, there was sort of that one character, like the maid, or that sort of motif, that archetype that would come in and sort of add to that comic relief as well.
And if I can add a little bit to that, there's sort of this idea that literature has to be boxed, but I think that literature is often, it's sort of always challenging itself. And so right now, what may be considered challenging the borders of predefined literature, as we said earlier, literature is defined by the people who come next. And so what we're writing right now is challenging what was written before us. So we are challenging these perhaps postmodernist and modernist ideas and sort of pushing what literature is, and the diversity and the new sort of boundaries that we create, someone else is going to have to break them in the next 10, 20, 30 years.
What a marvelous way to kind of conclude that. And I want to just sort of, I hesitate to even take 1 second away from you guys' amazing comments, but as an academic, I want to point out to you that one of the ways in which notions of canon and what constitutes literature were challenged, but was by the entry of women and people of color into the academy as academics. And in that capacity as students and as writers, we have tremendous influence on the future of what is literature, what is great. So you're doing that work right now. Let's give our presenters a round of applause and also the excellent questions. Really terrific panel, everyone. Thank you. And now off to yet another fabulous hour and 15 minutes of intellectual stimulation. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a wonderful day.
Yes, you guys too. Great work, all three of you. Really, really wonderful.
Thank you. You guys had such interesting presentations, honestly.
No, I loved hearing your presentations. It was so interesting.
Very great job to both of you.
Yep, great work, you guys.
Great job.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you. Bye.